Hello, my name is Nick Schramek, and I'm here with Howard Chow, and we are the founding partners of a company called Dune Insights. At Dune Insights, we are bringing together a community of early stage tech startups, investors, corporates, and others in the innovation ecosystem. We gather this community together several times a year to take a look at some of the most cutting edge startups out there as a lens into what technologies are coming next. I've been working with tech startups and investors in Silicon Valley for almost a decade, helping them source capital and understand the innovation ecosystem.
I'm Howard Chow, the other co-founder of Dune Insights, and as well an active early stage tech investor. After a career as a corporate lawyer, I started investing in tech companies about a decade ago. And in order to educate myself on my investments, I began inviting some smart friends up to my ranch outside of Silicon Valley in the mountains of Santa Cruz to talk about tech and learn about new startups and startup investment opportunities. And then a couple of years ago, as my business on the event side got bigger, I invited my friend Nick to join me to form a company to continue this work and to build our network of investors and innovators. So why another podcast? Well, Nick and I speak to some really smart people each day in our search for the best new startups out there. We also speak to some top investors, both from the venture side as well as large corporations who are experts in their domains. And with so many interesting conversations, we just felt that more people would benefit from hearing these conversations. So we're recording these conversations and making them available to the public.
With this new podcast, which we are entitling What's Next In, Howard and I take a look at several key industries that are experiencing monumental changes recently and will most definitely look nothing like they have in the next 10 or 20 years. Our work at Dune Insights and this podcast currently focuses on four main areas. One, the future of food and agriculture. We are in the middle of a revolution right now in the way that we produce, distribute, and eat food, and what we eat as well. People want more of their food, demanding that it not only be nutrient rich, but also safe to eat, readily available, and affordable. Doing this in an increasingly complex world with challenges in supply chains, food safety, and food security, not to mention reducing the impact that food and agriculture have on climate change, will require numerous technological innovations. Luckily, there are brilliant people trying to solve these challenges.
Number two, we focus on the future of mobility. As we all know, the entire model for energy sources and propulsion for transportation is undergoing radical transformation. Not just one, but tens of large companies are facing huge disruption unless they reinvent themselves. This is, of course, primarily driven by concerns about climate change, which has triggered the move towards alternative energy sources, electrification, and new energy storage technologies. Facilitating these changes are new classes of sensors, advances in robotics, pervasive AI, and better communication systems. It's an exciting soup of new technologies and business models.
Number three is the coming world of Web3. Despite the recent crypto winter, we believe that in the medium to long term, blockchain will change technology and how we run our lives in fundamental ways in the same way that the internet did. The movement of top talent and capital into crypto and Web3 ideas continues apace, and traditional financial institutions have not paused their digital asset initiatives. Right now, we tend to think of Web3 and crypto as a sector, but in the future, it will pervade everything. Just like we stop thinking of internet companies as a category, so will we stop thinking of crypto companies as a category.
And our fourth area of focus is the future of legal technology. As a former longtime corporate lawyer, I can attest that the legal services industry has been one of the slowest adopters of technology around, but that is changing. Precisely because so little has been done to modernize the industry means that there is a lot of upside. A substantial number of young lawyers and technologists have jumped on this opportunity to provide more efficient technology solutions to law firms, to companies, and consumers. To me, one of the most exciting developments in the sector is what can be done on the B2C front. Software and AI is now able to provide legal services to consumers in areas where previously no services were available because law firms didn't want to provide services at really low costs. So these four areas are each facing their own challenges, but one thing they have in common is that they are all dominated by big incumbents that have for decades now been able to get by with incremental innovation. While other industries have witnessed technological leaps that have seen winners take a large market share, these four areas are still dominated by companies that have been around for decades, if not for 100 years, So their time in the limelight may be coming to an end if they're not able to innovate and create new paradigms for their business. So we hope you enjoy this wide-ranging podcast series. Listen on.
Hi, this is Nick Tramick. I'm here with my partner Howard Chow, and we are founders of Dune Insights, and this is episode 1 of our podcast, What's Next In. This podcast episode, we are interviewing Ron Meeusen of Cultivian Sandbox. Ron has really seen it all in ag and food tech. Ag and food tech has been something that we've at Dune Insights cared about for a long time, and Howard, you've cared about and invested at for a long time as well.
That's right. It's probably the area that we spent more time on than anything else. And we've been in it since maybe 10 years ago, right? So, and I have quite a few personal investments in the area. It's also an area which has become more and more mainstream over this period of time. At the very beginning, it was somewhat of an outlier. I mean, venture capital had relatively little interest in ag and food tech. It had a reputation for being a slow roll kind of investment and didn't necessarily give you the kinds of venture style returns that you would want. But today, there's a lot more money going into ag and food tech. There have been some serious exits in both ag and food tech. And also, of course, people are much more aware now that the agriculture and food sectors have a big carbon footprint. And so in order to solve the climate change issues, you really have to address ag and food tech as one of the sectors that has to be changed.
Yeah, that's right. And I would say that problems often breed innovation. And right now we have numerous problems in our ag and food space. So we have supply chain issues that have only gotten worse through COVID. People care much more about personal nutrition, food security and safety in developing countries and all countries around the world are now front and center. So this is an area that has numerous issues. And if we are going to continue to feed billions of people around the world, tech is going to play a role in that.
Absolutely. So we find it exciting for quite a few different reasons, and there's also a lot of downsides if we don't get this right. I mean, in the U.S., we worry about it in the context of inflation and food prices. In other parts of the world, they worry about it in terms of can we survive and not starve, right? So these are big issues. And Ron is someone who has seen the changes in ag and food tech from the very beginning. As you will hear, he started one of the very first ag and food tech funds, venture funds, and when he started investing, there was virtually nobody else that was doing this, or very few people. So he's seen it all from the very beginning, and I think one of the interesting things to hear in his discussion is just how this whole sector has changed. When we first started doing our events in ag and food tech maybe 10 years ago, it was mostly about precision agriculture and sensors and a few other subjects, but it's gotten much broader than that, as you know.
Yep. All right, with that, let's go ahead and go right to the interview with Howard and Ron Meeusen.
I'm here today with one of the pioneers of ag and food tech, Ron Meeusen of Cultivian Sandbox. Ron is an old friend who has been to Bonnie Doon for many, many times. In fact, I think that Cultivian has had somebody at Bonnie Doon for all 9 years of our workshop series. So I'm actually quite proud of that. And Ron is here with us to talk about, well, his career in ag and food tech. So welcome, Ron, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Howard.
So Ron, I want to start by asking you to just give a little bit of personal background on where your origins are. How did you start your life and career?
Not the typical start for a science career. I started in a Catholic seminary studying to be a priest, but the inability to answer questions definitively with experiments kind of got under my skin after a while, and you combine that with the Catholic Church's insistence on lifetime celibacy, and that was enough to get me to leave the seminary and pursue a career in science. So I went over and got a degree in plant physiology, and was lucky enough to win a predoctoral fellowship that took me to Berkeley to get a PhD. So that's kind of how I got my start.
Right. So I know that after you graduated, you went into the corporate world, as I recall, and maybe you can talk about how you made the transition from the corporate world to the more exciting world of VC. I both are good, of course, but I have, as you and I know, the world of VC is pretty cool.
The world is pretty cool. I joined the corporate world at a very fortunate time. 1979, I joined Roman Haas, and I joined a group of chemists to help them use biochemistry to design safer herbicides. That was the original goal. It lasted all of 3 months, Howard, and I was called into the director's office, and he handed me a gold credit card with my name on it. And I said, "What's this?" And he said, "You're going to go out and look at this new thing called biotechnology." He said, "Our CEO and our board of directors want to know, is it real or is it hype? If it's real, will it affect our business? And if yes to the first two, what should Roman Haas do?" Just a case of being in the right place at the right time. But and I remember thinking, this is an important moment. It called for some kind of profound comment, but all I could muster was, "Why me?" And he laughed and said, "As far as we can tell, this is all new territory. There are no experts. Why not you? Go out and help us figure this out." So that turned me 90 degrees into leading biotechnology R&D exploratory projects of increasing size. By 86, I was running the world's first field test of a GMO corn. Had to write some of the early patents. It was all new, and we were making it up as we go. So that was a 25-year career, to get to your question, that culminated in my running biotechnology R&D for Dow Chemicals Ag Division in Indianapolis. About that time, when we get to the transition to venture capital, about that time I was doing some pro bono work with a group, a not-for-profit in Indiana called BioCrossroads. They were doing an economic development study, and one of the areas was food and ag, and they asked me to oversee that. And as we were studying that space and the flow of innovations in, one of the things I asked the analyst to do was, identify some of the venture funds that would fund new ideas in agriculture and food. And he came back about 2 weeks later and said, "I can't find any." And I said, "Oh, grasshopper, markets are efficient. There's no way that they've overlooked this whole sector." But he insisted. And so I started calling venture funds, the well-established ones, the ones that have been around since the 60s, saying, "Look, we're doing this economic development study for a not-for-profit for the state of Indiana, and I just need to know, who do you call when you see a good ag tech venture startup?" And Howard, one after another, told me the same thing. No one's doing it.
This is in the early 2000s, was it? Or when
Yeah, this is about 2005.
Okay.
And group after group said, nobody's doing it, but somebody should, because we see deals that look interesting, and we would co-invest if there were a fund to lead, a specialty fund that focused in the area. Right. So that's where I got the idea. And my kids were out of college. I was in a position to take a risk. So I quit my job at Dow and left the corporate world to raise a venture capital fund. And that's really how it got started.
So my description of you as a pioneer is actually pretty accurate, sounds like, huh? Despite your modesty. So that was close to 20 years ago, and you described it as biotech, but maybe you could describe a little bit more. What were the primary themes back then that you were looking at that you thought were the opportunities, and how has that changed since then? I mean, what's different now?
Yeah, I would say there have been three kind of transitions. The initial themes were really on production agriculture. And I would say production agriculture historically, that is focused on efficiency, cost efficiency, better weed control, better insect control, better disease control, more yield per acre, more milk per cow, technologies behind the scenes, upstream from where the consumer sees. and more B2B type things. And in those early days, Monsanto and the big players who provided inputs, they were the ones who would acquire those companies. And in fact, they bought our very first investment. So that was where we started. What the big change over the last 20 years that I've seen is that increasingly the end consumer has become more and more concerned with how their food is produced. And those end consumer desires have rippled back up the value chain all the way to production. So we started with technologies that would make the farmer more efficient, make production more efficient. It gradually became more of a focus on food and food quality and animal welfare, and then the more of a consumer brand. It became more of a consumer brand issue than it did just a purely cost of production issue. And then the third phase, which we've gone into over the last, I'd say 6 to 7 years, is as impact investors began to realize that if you want to make an impact on the footprint of the environmental and social footprint of humanity, food and ag, how we produce our food and our fiber to feed and clothe us, has a massive footprint, and you almost need to have food and ag technology innovations at the center of an impact funding. So we kind of went from production agriculture to meeting consumer demands to meeting ESG or becoming central to ESG.
Right. So there's been quite an evolution, and I can see why ag and food tech have kind of merged to a certain extent because of this evolution, and the role of the consumer has become much more prominent in all of this, where you probably weren't thinking about the consumer too much at the beginning, I assume.
No, in fact, most of the consumers were, hey, the EPA takes care of that, and the FDA takes care of safety, and I'm really not particularly concerned about it, and that's changed a lot.
Right. So let's peel back the onion a little bit more on today. So today, the world of ag and food tech seems to have gone pretty mainstream. There are lots of new exciting ideas, new technologies that are coming at us, and you're probably seeing hundreds of these ideas every year. What are the most important and exciting technologies or business models that excite you today?
There are two really big buckets. One is using biology to replace chemistry writ large. In the 50s, synthetic organic chemistry using petrochemicals as a feedstock just did miracles. Just created every kind of material we could have wanted, every kind of drug, every type of and that was the big driver. Today, the driver is much more using living systems, living materials, through genetics, to replace petrochemically derived materials. And that's just a huge area. It still has a long way to go to make a dent, because the sheer volume of oil that gets turned into through synthetic chemistry gets turned into everything from spandex to the frame of the computer I'm talking to you on, to my eyeglasses. But if eventually all of those are subject to replacement with biologically derived materials, and in many cases they bring unique functionalities that are not achievable by organic chemistry. So that's one big part. The other big part is around the digitization of agriculture, which is it's a very difficult undertaking. In fact, both of these face a couple of challenges. One is that much of agriculture and much of our food production is on an annual cycle.
Mhm.
So if you're coming up with a better crop, for example, at most you can do 2 tests a year.
Right.
One in the northern hemisphere, one in the southern hemisphere. And if you need 10 tests in runs in the field to get there, you're now 5 years out,
Mhm.
not even counting regulatory. So that's something that the pharmaceutical industry can do more quickly in most cases, and other industries can. The second big challenge is that while consumers increasingly want food that's produced, in a regenerative fashion, and it takes into account social requirements and animal welfare and greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. At the same time, there's very little tolerance for food to become expensive, because when food becomes expensive, the poor don't eat. And so we're in this
Yep.
dual kind of restriction, that we need to have innovations that meet consumer demands but don't increase already relatively thin profit margins.
Yeah. So I guess one phrase that has been used to describe this overall trend is instead of software eating the world, now we have biology eating the world, right? And that's true not only of ag and food tech, but of a lot of other areas of technology. But in ag and food tech, historically, when it comes to investments and investors, the return cycle has been a lot slower than a lot of other sectors. Maybe that's been changing somewhat. And in particular, I think in food tech, perhaps a little bit faster than ag tech, in my impression. But talk to us a little bit about how you think about how the longer cycles of investment and return in this sector affect your thinking about investing.
Well, it has several effects, Howard. And I'll talk about venture funds, but then I'd like to comment on other investment sources,
Right.
And their role. Venture funds with a typical 10-year plus 2 1-year extensions cycle. Basically, what the longer cycles for many of the food tech, ag tech innovations mean is that we must invest at later stages, because we just don't have enough timeline for a very long-term cycle. So investing at later stages is one pressure we constantly face. Unlike the pharma industry, there isn't a tradition of the big established companies buying in at the first proof of concept, like they will for a phase 2 clinical trial drug. And typically, the cycle times is longer. The second thing it does is it does force VCs to prioritize things that can scale quickly, like software,
Right.
Internet of Things, remote sensing, data analytics, those types of things. But it does leave the door open and we're increasingly seeing investment groups come into this space who aren't constrained by the 10-year cycle. I'm thinking of large family offices,
Right.
where they can make an investment and they can give it 15 years. And have that kind of patient capital is becoming a very important complement to the venture world.
Yeah, because a lot of the really important stuff, especially in biotech, is, as opposed to digitalization, is taking place at a slower pace, but it is important. I mean, it really, and I guess the question that comes up often is who's going to fund all of that. Besides, there are only so many family offices.
Yes,
But there are early stage funds, I guess, in this area too. So
there are. I have to say, the seed funds in this area, I really admire them, because that is tough.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, we're trying to keep this at 30 some minutes, so I'm going to turn to a slightly different subject, which is going from the technical to the global. So we live in a world where, macro shocks seem to be coming at us every other month. whether it's COVID, whether it's trade wars, whether it's um, the Ukraine war, whether it's the energy crisis, whether it's inflation or interest rates, all of these, of course, affect our industry. But maybe you can say a few words about how this is affecting ag and food tech investing, the macro shocks that are hitting us at this point, and food price spikes in particular.
Well, I have a bit of a contrarian view on food price spikes, and that is we in America certainly we tend to look at food prices, and a 10%, 20% spike, we tend to look at that as a problem. Americans spend on average 20 to 30% less on food than Europeans and many other parts of the world. Food here is cheap. Now, historically, that's our norm, and when it goes up, we tend to see it as a shock. But the reality is that our food systems have been surprisingly resilient. There hasn't been a famine. I mean, how many people can actually say, I went to the store and I couldn't get something I wanted? And not just grain and bread and eggs, but guavas from imported from 6,000 miles away are still in our stores. So I do feel like to some degree, the more recent hand-wringing over disruptions in the supply chains, even through the pandemic, have been overwrought
for this country, right?
Certainly for this country. Certainly, actually, I generalize that to the wealthier countries do well. Yeah. The problem that hits that is so serious is that whenever food supplies get short, they naturally flow to the countries that can pay for them, and the ones who suffer are the ones who don't have the personal income. And that's where the FAO and the UN have to take a really strong role in reminding everyone that just because in the US you're only paying 10% more for 20% more for corn, and that doesn't bother you. In some countries it's the difference between people being able to feed their kids or not. And that's pretty fundamental. And unfortunately, the venture world is a little too buffered from that.
Yeah, we tend to be focused on our own countries. Yeah. So let's turn back to technology again a little bit. So the trends within ag and food tech are complex, and one of the trends, as you well know, is in addition to traditional agriculture, which itself is being disrupted by all kinds of new technologies, we have new flows of food production coming at us, whether it's indoor, controlled environment agriculture, or whether it's synbio, using little critters inside of fermenters to make food. Can you sort of map out what you think is a likely scenario for these different streams of food production to develop the dynamics of them, and are we going to hit a new equilibrium in terms of the percentages of food production from these different sources?
It'll be a complex answer, and I don't have a particularly good insight into that. I would point out that in the US alone, there are 900 million acres of farmland producing crops and fiber, et cetera. Replacing a significant proportion of that in even 25 years is a daunting undertaking to contemplate. I expect things like controlled environment production, indoor, farming to grow, but I expect it to grow. I think if 25 years from now, 5% of our farmland is replaced, that's probably a realistic estimate. Now, that's still a big market opportunity.
A lot. That's still a lot.
It's still a lot, but just the sheer scale of that is pretty impressive. And the other thing that we need to bear in mind is when we're looking at a disruptive technology, the technology you're trying to disrupt isn't sitting still.
Yeah.
I was just looking up some numbers recently. In 1900 versus 2000, past century. In America, we are feeding and clothing 3 times the population on 50 million acres less land. I mean, we've taken 50 million acres out of production, and we're still producing 3 times as much on that same land. Every year corn yields go up 1.5 to 2.5%, and the same with wheat, rice, and other things. And to put that in perspective, the biggest, I believe the biggest park in North America is Yellowstone. It's 2.2 million acres. Well, just since 2000, we have taken out of production 25 times Yellowstone. Imagine if Congress had appropriated 25 new Yellowstones in the past 20 years, how they'd be bragging. And just traditional agriculture's annual increase in efficiency has done the equivalent.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And would you say that the trend lines are different in other parts of the world? I mean, the developing world and particular countries like India and China have different land and tillage conditions, right? So how do you see places in other parts of the world evolving on these technologies?
It's uneven. Right. I have a friend at the Gates Foundation who's involved in that, in trying to help the billion of our brothers and sisters around the world who live on at $1 to $2 a day to double their income. And those people, overwhelmingly, they eat what they grow. So it's really an agricultural problem. And there are places where practices haven't changed. Right. And the land is depleted. I was flying over Guatemala some time back, and the rivers, it was just heartrending because the people are still practicing slash and burn and then move on these steep hillsides, and the rivers are nothing but mud. They get one season, and so there are places where it's not getting better, but there are many places where it is. Kenya, Nigeria, areas in Southeast Asia where modern genetics are easy to transport. And many of the modern biologicals are easy to transport and adopt. So many of the innovations are flowing out of the US, but it's a highly variable story, and I'm not sure I'm the best one to characterize it globally.
So Ron, you and I have had discussions about how all of these trends will affect our reliance upon animal protein. We devote a huge amount of our row crop production to feeding animals that then feed us protein, and that absorbs a huge amount of water and fertilizer and energy, and creates pollution, and all these other externalities that you and I know about. So there's one theory that animal usage in production is actually going to go down over time significantly. How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, it's a hard one to handicap, Howard. Personally, I think we'll see animal production continue to grow slowly as long as the global population is growing, up to maybe 2050 when it peaks, and then start coming down. And the reason I say that is such a high percentage of the global population is still protein deficient, not having too many people still can't eat meat and want to. And as
meat is the prestige food from
and meat is the prestige food. Yeah.
that are coming out of subsistence.
Yeah, a compliment used to be he's a meat eater. You know, in the Middle Ages, he's a meat eater. By God, he's so successful he can eat meat every day.
Right.
So I think that, you know, if we continue to raise living standards around the world, it'll continue to raise the demand for animal protein, at least until population. However, I do think we are likely to see over the next 20 years, more and more of our grain, you know, as I mentioned, the grain supply keeps going up globally, faster than what the animal production will be. And I think we'll see more and more of that grain being converted into sugars to feed fermenters to drive the synthetic bio replacement of petrochemicals, and to see the alternative proteins that are being produced, you know, for primarily for those who can pay for them, but you know, in the developed world, a significant portion of the population wants to eat less red meat, but they're okay eating, you know, microbially produced the same proteins. You know, they want the food to taste the same, and the Impossible Burger and the Beyond Meats, etc.
Right. So,
but that is going to take a lot of grain. I mean, that a lot of sugar is going to be needed if you're going to replace even 2 or 3% of what we're doing there.
Right. And so this could be a potential replacement stream for animal protein. But you and I also have discussed how that may be, there may be constraints on that production flow as well, because we actually don't have a lot of fermenters around the world today. I mean, the fermenters around the world today are dedicated historically to other uses like beer production, for example, or whatever. And those may not be the right kinds of fermenters for what we're looking for to do. So what's your best estimate about this issue?
It's been hard to get reliable data on that, Howard, because I've not been able to find a study that tracks global fermentation capacity by type. The data seems to be scattered all over, but the people who have looked at it, there was a McKinsey report, Warner and Guskey, the consulting group, did a very nice piece. And those numbers are pretty sobering. For example, it's been estimated that if 1% of the egg white protein market is to be taken up by the fermentation, you know, in yeast, which Perfect Day is doing, 1%, it means we have to double. 1% of one product means doubling the global fermentation capacity.
Yeah.
I've seen estimates as high as $2 to $3 trillion of new fermenters would need to be built.
Yeah.
Just to keep both the synbio, you know, production of products that replace petrochemicals and the alt protein to replace animal protein, that, you know, it could be several $1 trillion over the next 10 years. I mean, this is near term. So it does look like there's a crunch coming. Now, there are alternatives, and you know, I'm involved with a company that's producing some of these proteins in corn. You know, that's easier to scale, and you don't have to build big fermenters. I know there are a couple of other efforts going on to see if you can't modify a lot of the existing bioethanol facilities.
Right.
You know, where you've already got some CapEx in the ground, but it's something to watch.
Yeah, it's amazing how much capital investment is going to be required to get us to net zero across all industries, right? I mean, this is just one example, and you're talking about trillions of dollars. I mean, when you also think about electrification of the transportation industry, or whether you're talking about, you know, heat pumps for all homes across the world, burning gas or whatever, those are huge capital investments that the world is going to have to make.
Yeah, and we will have to make them.
Yeah, yeah, amazing. So, well, we are kind of running out of time here. This has been a great tour of the ag and food tech scenery. Um, I let me ask one last sort of personal question for you, since I think the audience is probably going to be interested in this. They probably don't know that you're a aficionado of the bringing back chestnut trees to the world, to the U.S. So maybe you can talk a little bit about your efforts in that area, and I know that you have a couple of chestnut trees that you're.
I do. I don't know how many people know that the entire eastern seaboard of the U.S. was populated by chestnuts, the American chestnut, until the chestnut blight came in from overseas and wiped them out. 4 billion pounds of chestnuts a year were fed bears and otters and squirrels. I mean, it was a major component of our ecosystem. And there is a small not-for-profit group called the American Chestnut Foundation that I'm part of. And they have been working for almost 30 years now on 3 or 4 different approaches to breed resistance into the American chestnut and bring it back. And as a member and someone who donates, I get the opportunity to buy each year 3 of the seeds of this precious next generation. And so they're growing outside in pots, and probably they're the most pampered and babied plants that have ever existed. But
how tall are they now?
Oh, they're only about yay big.
Oh, okay.
This will be a labor for the next 10 or 15 years. But if we can bring that back, it's a major missing piece of our ecosystem. And people are trying to. I mean, they're trying both breeding with Chinese chestnuts and others that have resistance. They're trying genetic engineering approaches. They're trying gene editing. But it takes about 7 years to do one breeding cycle of a chestnut. So it's a long-term effort of love.
Terrific. Well, this has been very interesting, very exciting. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ron. And I'm sure the audience will be fascinated with what you've had to say. We look forward to having you in Bonnie Doon again soon.
I look forward to it as well. Thank you.
All right. Thanks.